We now come to questions from the lawyers, and they're over here. I had a friend in Sydney who had been a distinguished, or was a distinguished lawyer, but he was hopeless around the house, and he had a dripping tap one weekend, and his wife was driving him mad. Can't you fix this? He got so irritated he called a plumber out of hours. Plumber came round, took him 3 minutes, 4 minutes to fix it. He gave the bloke a bill for about $75. The lawyer gasped and said, "That's impossible." He said, "On that hourly basis, you know, you're charging about 4 times what I can charge." To which the plumber replied, "I know, that's why I changed." Anyway, we now come, Gabby, to you, Gabby Jackson. You run first, I think.
Yes.
Your opportunity to pose questions to both of our experts here, and we're going to allow you 10 minutes, give or take, very little. It's over to you, and then we'll follow with Andrew Schultz.
Okay. Thank you very much. I thought both the presentations were excellent and very stimulating. Chris, my first question is to you. What do you say is the actual evidence for the fact of the resurrection from the New Testament sources?
I think there's lots of different kinds. But if you're distinguishing between evidence of the resurrection and evidence for the belief in the resurrection, is that the distinction you're making? Then it's blended in together. My point is that clearly the early Christians believed in the resurrection, but with Hans' earlier comment, I'm not sure that I believe in belief. Belief isn't an extra source of information. Belief is an attitude to things you think are facts. What we have in the New Testament is reports of people who believed in the resurrection and some of the reasons they said they did. Now, those are all blurred in together, sometimes in material like Paul's material in 1 Corinthians, sometimes in narrative material.
I suppose I'm looking for the reasons for belief.
Right. The reasons for belief, well, I think the most striking one, and this was going to come up later, but I'll bring it in now. I think I disagree with Hans' analysis of what's going on in 1 Corinthians 15. I think the conditional hypothetical, if this weren't true, we'd all be wasting our time. I think that's purely a rhetorical flourish. I don't think that's constitutive of Paul's argument at all. I think what is constitutive of Paul's argument is you should believe in the resurrection of Jesus because I have 500 eyewitnesses, most of whom are still alive.
But is that, I mean, I'm of Hans' view that it is some sort of hypothetical. If no resurrection, then your faith is futile. That's essentially his line.
Yes, that's one of his lines.
Yes, exactly. And I love how he finishes the section. We're saying if the dead are not raised, let us eat, drink, and drink, for tomorrow we die. So faith is pointless. So I think would you agree that for Christians, resurrection is a foundational belief?
I think for the sort of Christians I think for the sort of Christian I am, absolutely. There are various and sundry varieties of liberal Christian who think that resurrection is a great metaphor and really important spiritually. But for me, the question, did it really happen, and how likely is it that we can argue reasonably that it happened? I think that's absolutely foundational. It may be a great metaphor, but if it's not true, I'm with Paul.
Yeah, and that's really the topic for tonight. I mean, Paul says he had revelation, he heard some voices. You know, he was blinded, he didn't see anything, nothing appeared. What are in his letter, are the actual words used resurrection? Would you translate them as resurrection, or are they other words for seeing and awakening rather than resurrection? And resurrection, I look at the copy of the Bible that Craig got me before I started on this, and you know, the letter of 1 Corinthians has a subheading, the resurrection of Christ. Now, is that the actual word used in the Greek text? I mean, Paul, in the passage that you quoted, talks about revealed. They were revealed and they appeared. So
the answer is there's a mixture of terminology used. Some of the terminology is clearly technical, some of it is general purpose Greek words that is probably just being used the way we use language all the time. When Paul says he saw particular things, the word saw does not specify by stimulation of the optic nerve or something else, because ordinary people use words the way ordinary people use words. On the other hand, some of the language is technical. For example, the word anastasis, which is the one normally translated resurrection, is not a word that is normally used for other kinds of life after death.
And that means stood up, doesn't it? Is that right?
At a literal level, that's what it means, yes.
Stood up,
and it means stand up after you've been lying down for a while.
Dead.
Exactly. So there's a combination. There's ordinary language that could be read several different ways because that's the way people use language. And there's technical terms which clearly have technical meanings for both the writer and his presumed audience. And they're in there together.
Yeah. You're probably familiar with the work of N.T. Wright.
Yep.
Yeah, and he has in one of his books an argument, an inference to the best explanation, and the two bits of gospel evidence that he says justifies belief in the resurrection or knowledge of the resurrection is the empty tomb and the post-death appearances, obviously. For him, those two are sufficient grounds for belief in the resurrection. What do you think about that?
I think there's actually quite a few unspoken premises in that argument, and because Wright wrote at least 700 or 800 pages, my guess is they are actually in the book as well. But if you sum up a large and complex argument into those 2 points, it won't necessarily be at its best. Nonetheless, the great majority of historians who do deal with this material, and I don't just mean Christian historians either, Michael Grant and Geza Vermesh, for example, one Greco-Roman historian, one Jewish historian, both came to the view that the empty tomb was historically likely. I've lost my thread.
Empty tomb and
empty tomb and post-resurrection appearances. Here we're in a more complex area, and Hahn has referred to this, and I think he's right to do so. The fact that people believed they saw Jesus may mean nothing. It may simply mean they were deluded. But it could mean that they saw something extraordinary. It could even mean that that extraordinary thing was Jesus back from the dead. Put that together with the question of the empty tomb, and it is certainly a highly provocative issue. Sure. But I don't think it's proof neat.
No, we're in probability and inference to best explanation and trying to convince an atheist, essentially. So Paul, he didn't write narrative, did he? He just wrote letters and in the nature of pronouncements or announcements as to...
I mean, there are bits of narrative in the letters, but he's not writing narrative.
In the sense of a narrative of Jesus, a narrative about his own life and, bits of what he's experienced on his journeys.
I think it's clear that Paul knows quite a bit about Jesus' life and occasionally refers to it, usually as something that can be taken for granted rather than something that has to be explicitly spelled out. But historians argue about that one way or another.
I've got a question now about your third point, about the evidence for Alexander the Great, and I think Hahn may want to comment on this as well. Why isn't a better analogy, rather than Alexander the Great, who lived approximately or died 300 odd years before Christ, why don't you compare the extant historical evidence for someone, say, a contemporary or near contemporary like Julius Caesar or Augustus, or, I don't know, Pompey, Mark Antony. Why isn't that a better comparison than, Alexander the Great, who was a world figure on anyone's scale, probably more so than JC, but maybe either JC.
They were certainly different.
Why did you use that as a meter stick?
Yes, the reason I did that, there are two reasons. Number one, the neatness of the fact that there are four major sources which probably, but we can't prove the detail, go back to eyewitnesses. That makes an interesting and provocative parallel. The other reason I didn't choose someone like Julius Caesar is it's not a good parallel, because we have quite a number of works written by Julius Caesar himself.
I suppose that's my point, you see.
Yeah. And that makes it, I think, not a similar case.
But, I mean, the 300 years, given the vagaries of histories, you would expect to lose a whole lot more documents, you know, given what they were written on and things like that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure of...
Well,
yes, you're right, but I'm not sure where the question's going.
What do you think, Han? Have you got...
I just wondered about this point, why would Julius Caesar not be a good comparison? I mean, do you think because he writes things himself, he's too close to the source?
I would absolutely think that in some cases. But what I'm actually saying is not that. What I'm actually saying is it's not a close comparison.
Okay, fair enough.
But certainly, I'm not trying to claim that the evidence for Jesus is better than the evidence for Julius Caesar. I'm saying that there is a similar issue in that you have sources written after the event as well, and I absolutely agree, by the way, that none of the sources are perfect and that a historian has to be critical of all of them.
Yeah.
Now, we're allowing around 10 minutes nominally for each. Gabby, are you ready to surrender now to Andrew?
I am. If my time is up, I'll happily surrender.
Well, we might as well go home then, I think. So, I just want to ask Han a question. Have you heard of E.P. Sanders, an agnostic Jesus scholar at Duke University? I just don't want to ask an unfair question.
I'm afraid not.
Okay, so, well, there we go. So maybe we'll ask Gabby if neither of the two historians know the answer.
But you can tell me about him.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll ask then Chris first. I've heard that E.P. Sanders is an agnostic Jesus scholar, an agnostic historian. Is that right? Is he a believer or...?
I'm not absolutely certain, but if he's a Christian, he is a very liberal Christian rather than a mainstream or evangelical Christian. He may well be an agnostic, I'm not certain.
Right, and going over to Han, would you describe yourself as an atheist or an agnostic?
I'm probably more an agnostic, and that is just because, as I said in the opening words when I started my particular little talk, I said, look, if I can't bring myself to believe in this particular event, although I don't dispute, for instance, that there might have been a historical figure called Jeshua or Jesus, but it's that resurrection story that I have real problems with. I would say, rather than be harshly judging other people, because sometimes people actually take it very personal. When I say it's not true, they think I somehow cast aspersions on them in believing it. And that's why I would prefer to say, well, I'm probably more an agnostic. I'm skeptical about the whole thing. And I can't bring myself, on the basis of what evidence has been presented, that this would be a real event.
Well, can I just read you then a quote by this agnostic? Can you tell me which parts of it you disagree with? So we'll leave the resurrection part of it out for now. We'll just go through events in Jesus' life. You tell me which ones you disagree with. So this is what he said. He said, there's no substantial doubts about the general course of Jesus' life. When and where he lived, approximately when and where he died, and the sort of thing he did during his public activity. I shall first offer a list of statements about Jesus that meet two standards. They're almost beyond dispute, and they belong to the framework of his life, and especially of his public career. It says here he was born in 4 BCE. I think we heard earlier from Chris that it's in about 4.
Yeah.
Did you accept generally around about that time?
It's to do with this whole business of the count of the population, and we know that where it is normally placed, there was no census of the population, so it has to be moved up or down a little bit. I mean, I don't think that's very crucial.
It goes on a bit later. He spent his childhood and adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptised by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in towns and villages in the countryside of Galilee. He preached the kingdom of God. At about 30, he went to Jerusalem for a Passover. He created a disturbance, had a final meal. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Is there any of that you disagree with?
I don't think so.
He then adds...
Can I clarify briefly? I mean, what I think is important is that what I believe to be useful sources in relation to these facts is not just the Gospels, but also some of the pagan sources that we have, Roman historians that talk about him, that actually inform us further about this particular individual that was there. And I believe that he was probably, as I infer from the evidence that we have, he was probably someone who was a little bit subversive, somebody who was streetwise, who was clever in getting up people's backs and thinking deeply about certain issues when it comes to religion and theology. That doesn't mean that he rose from the dead.
I understand that, so let's skip that part. We'll just go from there. We may add, he goes on, a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. His disciples fled, they saw him, in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he'd returned to found the kingdom, and they formed a community to await for his return. And then he goes on and he says this, that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is in my judgment a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. Do you accept that?
Well, I think I wouldn't quite put it in those terms, because what we really have here is somebody taking the word of these Gospels for an event that I refuse to accept. So I would, as I hinted earlier, I would really accept that people had some kind of subjective experience that in the context that they found themselves explained as, this is our leader who has been resurrected.
But do you accept that it doesn't require faith or belief in God or miracles to believe any of those facts that are asserted?
That's because I believe in historical method, and so I accept that he is a historical individual for which we have very reliable sources that reinforce some of the slightly less reliable accounts in the Gospels in historical terms, and therefore I think as a historical figure I have no problem accepting him.
So is it then fair to sum that up by saying you don't take issue with any of the parts of the Gospels that are describing events that, based on your worldview, you think could be true, but you draw the line at the actual rising from the dead?
That's really something I find highly problematic, yes.
So is there anything about the accounts and the way they're written, about those other things that you're willing to take for granted, that make them inherently more reliable than the claim that he rose from the dead?
Oh, that's a theme that defines religious studies. This is what all the religious professors and people in universities keep debating. And I think they will, so long as they don't get into a kind of proper agreement about some of the details, I think the problem stands.
All right, but essentially it's not the evidence that's the issue, is it? It's what we make of the evidence. It's what truth the evidence points to.
Well, yes, sometimes some of the evidence points in a certain direction, but you don't have to accept everything.
Sure.
And the issue was, look, we have Gospels here, the different stories of the resurrection account really shows that there are so many different details, and much of what is offered to us is an account by somebody. So we're told that somebody said that, and that's what I meant by twice removed accounts and reports on a certain event. It's very difficult to get behind that and what really is historical about it. What is historical about it is that these people believed in something, and I accept that they believed in something, but it doesn't mean I have to accept that.
Okay, switching now to Chris. Now, you by contrast are a Christian historian, right? Now, you seem to acknowledge that there are all these inconsistencies between the different gospel accounts, and you've acknowledged a lot of the points that have been made by Gabby and Han to some extent. Why do you therefore still believe it to be true?
The answer is that I don't accept all the inconsistencies that are suggested. Certainly there are inconsistencies, but number one, inconsistencies can prove different things. As I suggested, inconsistencies might well prove lack of collaboration, but they might prove other things as well, depending on the degree of inconsistency, the kind of inconsistency. So I agree there are inconsistencies, but I think they are inconsistencies consistent with the hypothesis of honest reporting of very confusing events, more than they are inconsistencies of a kind that suggest highly unreliable reporting. So that's part of my answer, but I've now lost the other part.
Well, just to give you something to talk about, really. No, that's fine. Going back to these points that I've just brought up in terms of things that are largely uncontroversial facts and don't require any belief,
Yes.
I've heard it said that they indicate, though, a resurrection-shaped dent in history. Do you accept that?
That's a view argued by Professor Mole of Cambridge in the 1960s. Mole argued that there were a whole series of arguments that suggested strongly that there was what he called a resurrection-shaped hole in first century history. He meant, in fact, that it is quite clear that something extraordinary happened 30 or 33 AD that formed an entire new movement which over time and over centuries became a dominant movement in the Greco-Roman world and then a dominant movement in Western civilization. And Moll, who argued historically for belief in the resurrection, said, look, if there is a resurrection-sized and shaped hole in first century history, what is the secular historian going to put in it?
Well, why don't we ask Khan that? What would you put in the resurrection-shaped dent in history?
Well, assuming that there was such a thing. I mean, it's a very interesting idea, but I think that what we do have is what I rather go by, and that is that we have historians from the early 2nd century who talk about this new, strange group led by a man called Christus, you know, the anointed one, as it were, that is really annoying the hell out of the Romans. And that's a very interesting point, because if he hadn't been so annoying, the Romans would probably not even have noticed him. So that's why I said earlier, he was certainly an individual that knew how to challenge authorities, and not only Roman authorities, but also Jewish authorities. But he was not the only one. He was not the only preacher in the street saying, look, we've got something different going on here. If we believe that we follow this particular authority, we should actually not do that. We know that there are many others, and I am excluding Brian, of course, but
What's wrong with Brian?
he is lovely, but he is a fiction on a fiction. So.
But isn't it the case that he got more annoying after he died and became more of a problem for the authorities? And that if, for example, he'd been left hanging on the cross and not buried in a tomb, Paul wouldn't have been able to say, at that time, there's 500 witnesses, you know, notwithstanding that he's died and risen, because people could have just easily said, well, we all know that's not true because there he is still on the cross.
But he is, I mean, in the most extreme interpretation, what we have with Jesus is not Christianity. What we have is a Jewish sect splitting itself off, as many others did, from the current Jewish beliefs. And then, in the 2nd and 3rd century, the real battle began over how to define themselves, and then they became followers of Christ, i.e. Christians. It's the same as with philosophical schools. Aristotle was not a peripatetic. Plato was not a Platonist. That's what comes after. So Christianity, yes, that became something annoying to the Roman authorities, but not Christ's resurrection.
Okay, I think, yes, you're entitled to, I'll give you 2 minutes because...
I would date the resurrection hole to when Constantine had his dream. That's when that occurred.
And is it then being taught that that was too late to disprove it?
You two both get a chance to summarise. Chris would like to comment, yes, and then just to forewarn you both, you have the opportunity to cross-examine one another briefly.
I just want to say that I don't actually disagree very much with what Han just said at all. I think most historians would agree that Christianity began as a sect breaking away from mainstream Judaism, that Jesus is best to be seen as a Jewish prophet, a prophet of the coming of the kingdom of God in first century Jewish terms. And in fact, in the New Testament, Christians don't call themselves Christians. Other people call them Christians, and it seems to be a bit of an insult. It's a word like Christies. It's that kind of a word. And Han is quite correct that in the 2nd century, they began to use this term of themselves as their own identifier. But I actually don't think that changes very much. It's important historically and semantically. But the movement that Jesus founded was absolutely based on the concept that he had been raised from the dead and the implications of that about the nature of the Jewish God and what the Jewish God was doing in the world. That's what the movement was driven by, and that's what characterised it in the 1st century. Yes, changes occur over time and develop. Absolutely, no question.
All right. Now, the evening we're about to throw open to your questions, well, I'm not throwing it open to the floor. We've collected your questions and tried to take a line through the common themes to best reflect the things that have been prompted by tonight's conversations. But before I do that, I'm giving both of you gentlemen an opportunity to ask a question of each other. And I sit squarely between you.
Have no fear, as the angel would say. I'm not the messenger of evil news. Look, to be fair, I think I would just redirect my question that I sort of half posed in my own little talk when I said to Chris, look, would you be willing to clarify to me what you said in relation to the different versions of the Gospels, and in particular what you meant by the phrase theological elaboration, because I'm clearly not sophisticated enough to understand what you meant there.
Okay. What I meant was, specifically, that the early Christians had a clear idea of what they thought resurrection should look like. I think I made the joking reference to the special effects you'd need to make a good movie about it. They thought that when the resurrection came, there would be the trumpet, the last trumpet, the call of the archangel of God, perhaps the resurrected shining like stars. They had a whole set of views about what a resurrection should be. What I didn't spell out very carefully, and I'm happy to have the chance to do so now, is that they saw a direct logical connection between Jesus' resurrection and the great resurrection to come, though they described it, agricultural metaphor, as the first fruits from the dead. In other words, what they were saying is Jesus' resurrection in some way is a down payment and a guarantee of what's going to happen at the end of the world. They had a theology about what would happen at the end of the world. What intrigues me is they do not elaborate the accounts in the Gospels using those special effects. They are more cautious in their reporting than we might have expected them to be. They could have said, for example, that when Jesus rose, the archangel blew his trumpet, because they thought that was something that happened at resurrections. They could have said that he shone like the stars. They didn't use these metaphors, and my best example is that after 3 days one. They clearly thought that resurrection was something that had a on the third day feel about it. But they didn't use that theological language. They simply said it happened on the day after the Sabbath. Now that to me sounds more like just narrative reporting than narrative reporting elaborated with theological motifs. Is that clearer?
Yes, it is. I understand better what you mean, especially with the word theological. But would you exclude John's Gospel from that, where people suddenly start to hit the heavens with their heads? Is that not special effects? Or?
No, that's the Gospel of Peter.
Peter, right.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is a document we barely knew existed until a copy of part of it was found in a tomb in Egypt in the 1890s, I think. I'm not sure of the details now. But several early Christian writers mention a thing called the Gospel of Peter, which they're not sure about. Then this document was found in Egypt in the 1880s, 1890s, and it seems to be the Gospel of Peter, as in Peter seems to be the narrator of it. It's the only one of the, quote, apocryphal Gospels, unquote, that probably comes from the 1st century. And yes, it's full of special effects. Absolutely it is. And it's an intriguing contrast to the canonical Gospels, because it is clearly based on the 4 canonical Gospels and embroidered on top of that with special effects. And I think the contrast between the Gospel of Peter and the canonical Gospels is actually quite a striking contrast.
All right. Thank you.
Anything further between you two that you see as important before we throw to the audience? If not...
Oh, can I ask Han if he would assent to a proposition? That's my way of saying I want to make a statement and turn it into a question.
You're not buying me dinner then?
Is that your question?
No, it was a rhetorical question.
Han said as a statement, the Gospels aren't history, they're not biography, and then I'm not quite sure I remember what you said they were instead.
There were sort of accounts of sayings and deeds. That's the traditional kind of...
Yes. My understanding is that the mainstream of scholarship is that the Gospels actually are very similar to Greco-Roman biographies, particularly to Greco-Roman biographies of the kind you and I are interested in for other reasons. Greco-Roman biographies of philosophers and religious teachers.
Which are terribly flawed because there's a lot of fiction in them. But
oh, absolutely. Absolutely they are. But you're absolutely right. They are a mixture of sayings and deeds.
Yeah,
that's acta et verba is the Latin formulation for that. I think the Gospels are, generically, biographies of that kind. But to say that they're not history seems to me not to be a useful claim. Of course they're not history, but they are sources that a historian can use like other sources and should use critically like they use other sources. Would you be happy with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Fine, thank you.
All right. Now, the first question from the floor goes to you, Han. Paul claims that his conversion from persecutor of Christians to a Christian was due to an encounter with the risen Jesus. What do you see as an explanation for his sudden turn?
It's a very tricky one, actually. I mean, the description itself of the conversion story and the sort of genre of conversion is a little bit unusual in antiquity. There's also a pagan tradition of philosophers changing philosophical school, as it were, and we forget that what we call philosophy in the ancient world is often also a lifestyle choice to some extent. In fact, the name for a school was based on the word for choosing, hieresis. But in case of Paul, would you believe it, and I don't have a strong view about this, but would you believe it that even neurosurgeons have busied themselves in trying to explain what happened to Paul when he had this miraculous conversion and the way in which it was happening? I mean, somebody very skeptical might say, you know, he fell on his head and just had a very strange, you know, concussion and saw things like flashes of light and hearing voices and whatnot. That's a very skeptical end of the spectrum. On the other hand, if a neurosurgeon is trying to actually find ways to explain the different phenomena that are being described as perhaps epileptic fits, you have the other end of the spectrum. I myself would say that what is interesting about miraculous experiences in the ancient world as well as today is that miracle is a very relative term. Miracle is something that transcends your expectations. Now, within a 21st century set of expectations about, you know, based on the science that we think we know and what we can explain on the basis of science, when something is put in front of our eyes that goes beyond that expectation, people might say, well, that was really a miracle. Or as Australians often say, legend. Right? I actually saw an interesting example of this kind only a few days ago on television, our other main source of historical information. It was an experiment where a particular individual showed that he was able to drink 4 liters of water and then reproduce it again through his mouth. He actually used it to actually they set a fire, and he sort of put out the fire with that. Now, a professor of physiology stood next to it and said, look, that's all very well, but if you drink more than 2.5 liters of water, you risk dying, literally dying, because what happens is if you drink that amount of water, it immediately goes into your bloodstream, it dissolves the body from the inside out. And then he saw it happen, and it was on camera. Should I now say I saw a miracle? Well, I would probably say, because the word miracle as a noun has a very strong, heavy notion of something you can't explain, I would say I saw something miraculous. And so did the professor of physiology, because it exceeded the total amount of expectations that he could muster on the basis of what he knew up until that point. Now, if you go back to Paul, whatever it was that he experienced, it must have been something so unusual within the patterns of expectation that he had that it completely changed his mind. That's what I would say to that.
Thank you. Chris, to you, is the reliability of the Gospels not weakened by the fact that their authors were all close personal friends of the subject, with a great personal and, in some cases, financial stake in the divinity of Jesus?
Answer, if they were, then yes, it would be, but they weren't. Let me spell out that rather oracular statement. Mark, as far as we know, was not a follower of Jesus. The only evidence that we have comes from the 2nd century, a quote from Papias, 2nd century church father, who says Mark was not a disciple of Jesus, but was later a follower of Peter. As to his financial status, I'm afraid I can't help you. There hasn't been an inquiry. Matthew, we simply do not know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The guess that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew the tax collector, who's called Matthew the tax collector in Matthew's Gospel, is a guess based on the coincidence of the names, and as far as I know, nothing else. So we simply don't know who wrote Matthew. It was a Jewish Christian in the mid to late 2nd century. That's as far as historians can go. Luke clearly was not a personal friend of Jesus. There's a strong case that I myself believe, though not everyone else does, that Luke was a close travelling companion of St. Paul. John may have been an actual original disciple of Jesus, but that is controversial in scholarship as well. So I think the premise of the question is undercut. I don't think these people were close personal friends of Jesus, and as for their financial motives, I don't think we have any information about that at all.
Thank you. Han, rational people do not usually present the preposterous as true when it is dangerous to do so. Why did the early Christians stick their necks out if the resurrection is untrue? Why, and furthermore, would you weigh in on the martyrdom of some of the apostles? Why would they willingly go to their deaths if they had not seen Christ resurrected?
Well, as to the first question, I mean, to sort of stick your neck out and say something that would seem preposterous is again similar to the notion of the miraculous. It assumes that these people would all really accept something that is preposterous. I think they would. In those days, again, the contrast with modern times is really quite stark. There is no proper scientific framework that gives you the arguments or the experiments to say, look, this is absolutely preposterous, untrue, unbelievable, and so on. These particular kinds of events could be claimed, and people had a choice to believe them or not. And in those days, it was one word against the other. That's why we hear of so many competing religions and of so many competing preachers. People could stand up and say, I think this is the case, I think we should read the scriptures in this way, I think this happened, and I believe that eyewitness over this eyewitness. There's nothing almost that is not to be believed in those days, because people were far closer to nature and far more liable or prone to believe something that we would call preposterous. As to martyrdom, how much time do we have? I actually happen to have done a little bit of reading on this, but I'm sure I don't know as much as Chris will. But what is interesting about the martyrs is that this kind of attitude only really gets going as a voluntary kind of action in the 2nd century and onwards. And things actually got so much out of hand that the church fathers, people who had risen to positions of authority, started to question whether this was really a good idea. Because once you have had one person willing to sacrifice themselves, to give their lives for their faith, which is not unusual. I mean, in 66 AD, in Israel, of course, the famous Masada suicide, where Masada was under siege by the Romans, is a very strong example in the Jewish tradition that they were willing to sacrifice their lives. So in that kind of world, where we know that certain people with a religious fervor were willing to do this, Christians followed suit. Once you've had a few, what you get is that people then started to volunteer massively. Because what is happening is they're being promised a better life in the next existence, the next world. And so the church actually had to curb at some point this kind of volunteering and this kind of martyrdom. And by the way, martyr actually just means you're a witness. So originally what people were doing is stating some kind of faith in this particular religion.
Yes, and then we'll ask Andrew and Gabby to sum up. But Chris.
If I may, I think a shorter answer to the question, which Han won't disagree with, would be the reason they did it is they did believe it. That doesn't mean they were right, but clearly the reason they were willing to die for their beliefs is that they did believe them. Where I disagree with Han, though, is this modern prejudice that says, look, people in the ancient world weren't skeptical, they just believed lots of things, and they believed lots of different things. And my problem with that is I actually don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is that I know that, for example, among the Greco-Roman elite, there were people who were perfectly able to be skeptical and even balance their skepticism with careful argument about things that we treat as superstition. I think of Cicero's work on divination. You've heard arguments about whether prophecy could actually be true, whether fortune tellers could actually be accurate, and you probably could put up an argument for and against, and why it is that some people believe in prophecy and astrology and other related things. But I'll guarantee you, there is no argument you will bring up that Cicero didn't have already. There were highly intelligent, sophisticated people in the ancient world, and some of them were illiterate. And some of them were ordinary, common sense people who would say, if you told them you'd just come to believe in the Messiah, he's not the Messiah, he's just a naughty boy. Or words to that. Now, you see, we are ancient historians. You can tell because we quote Monty Python. But my point is, I don't think people were actually, in general, less sceptical in the ancient world. I think there are times now when people are more and people are less sceptical. I think the same is true in antiquity. Certainly what Hans said about them not having rigorous scientific method applies. But there's an awful lot of people in the modern world who actually don't work with very rigorous scientific method either. A famous Gallup poll was done, I think in the 70s, I'm not actually sure, and it showed that 87% of modern, sophisticated, highly educated Americans believed in miracles. Now, that may prove something about Americans, or it may prove something about modern people in general. What it disproves, it seems to me, is that modern people don't believe in the miraculous. They clearly do. They may have silly reasons for doing so, or they may not, but clearly they still do. In other words, I don't think it's fair to simply say, in the modern world we've got much higher standards, in the ancient world they were gullible. I think that is way too simple.
Thank you. Now, Gabby and then Andrew, we're giving you 5 minutes each to summate your positions.
What a fascinating night. I think it's been replete with lots of interesting insights. The history of the New Testament is truly fascinating history. And I don't know about you, but I would really love an autobiography of Yeshua of Nazareth. That would be fantastic. The other thing that I learnt tonight is about the resurrection size hole, because I think that's a very sort of apt concept, because the resurrection has ramifications now. It's not, we are doing history, we're trying to find out the historicity of the resurrection, but it's a belief now that has an effect now in our lives. The fact of a resurrection runs counter to our understanding of how the world usually works. So it does create a dent in our understanding of the world. And in those terms, it is a miracle. It is miraculous. And in philosophy, David Hume's written a terrific little chapter analysing of miracles and when belief in miracles is justified. That's chapter 10 of his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is a fantastic book, and that chapter's fantastic. And it is an important issue for us now, not just 2,000 years ago. I, as an atheist, as Han has said, we both accept that Jesus, or Yeshua as I prefer to call him, Jesus is an anglicisation of his Greek name, was a man lived in Nazareth. The Bible says he had brothers and sisters, 4 brothers, sisters. He was obviously a very charismatic leader, teacher, healer. I mean, his mother and brothers were worried about him and tried to take him back home, that he was out of his mind when he was preaching in front of a crowd. Basically, the way I think Han and I see it, we take it from a sort of a position of atheism, that we need to be convinced by belief, looking at the evidence. That's essentially the historical or the scientific method. Our view, I think, based on Paul's view in Corinthians, is that resurrection for Christians is a foundational doctrine. That seems to certainly us, we've had a couple of discussions, to be what Paul is saying in that, because otherwise it's all at large. So it is an important issue for atheists, it's an important issue for Christians as well. I think there's probably no rational argument to the existence of God, so this is a way essentially of, if resurrection is a fact, then at least one, probably at least 2 gods exist as a consequence in what exists out there in the world. It furnishes the world, and we know it. There's a new pathway to knowledge, revelation, or inspired scriptures, whatever, it will give us that. So then it really then comes down to, what's the evidence? How good is the evidence? Does that justify an inference to the best explanation? So our view, I think, is that if you're positing the existence of something, the onus is on the Christian to prove it. And the evidence that we've tried to examine tonight is basically what's set out in the New Testament, and the primary source, all of the primary sources have been discussed. Paul's letters to the Corinthians, his own particular manifestations of God, and also the evidence presented in the Gospels. When you examine the evidence, just to finish, we've spoken a lot about inconsistencies, and I think there are inconsistencies. I would line them up as being a whole lot of improbabilities, where there was darkness at noon when he died, some curtain in the temple ripped, there was an earthquake, all those sort of physical things. There's basically, through the passion narratives and the resurrection narratives, there's a whole lot of things according to scriptures, and Hart has made a lot of this. That's really basically looking at the Old Testament and writing the story around prophecies that you can extract from the Old Testament. If you go from Paul, which is the earliest source, which are just really pronouncements, telegrams, from Mark through to John, you get increasing embellishment of the burial story, the death of Christ. And finally, another thing that Han has alluded to is the theological development over the time. I mean, one stark example is in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is quite timid and distressed. In John, he's totally in control. Basically, he commits euthanasia. He has a sip of water and then he just dies on the cross. He sort of somehow kills himself. So he goes from basically being a Messiah, which is a Christ, an anointed one, they mean the same thing, to John, to basically being the ever-existing God. So I think that's a development that you can see. You put all of that together, it just seems to be that it is a story, a very passionate story, but not convincing as factual evidence.
Thank you, Gabby. Andrew.
You know, this isn't actually the first time in history that people have gotten together to try and work out whether or not the claims that Jesus made about himself were true. In fact, the earliest surviving fragment of the New Testament just so happens to be this fragment you see on the screen. And as far as I understand, I'm sure Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, while the earliest manuscripts about Jesus date from the 300s, this fragment's in fact been dated to sometime in the 2nd century, possibly somewhere between 100 and 150 AD. Does that sound about right? Now, it just so happens that this fragment captures part of the account from the Gospel of John of the trial of Jesus by Pontius Pilate. And during that trial, Pilate's recorded as saying to Jesus, "You are a king then." Jesus answers, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And a very sceptical Pilate at the time responds with one of the greatest questions of all time. That is, of course, what is truth? Now, that's a question that I ask myself at the start of every case I work on. Not what does my client say happened, not what does my opponent say happened, not even what does the evidence suggest happened. I'm more interested in what actually happened. And you see, a lot of people, even lawyers, tend to confuse the evidence of what happened with the truth of what happened, but truth and evidence are two different things. Lawyers and judges strive to determine the truth based on the evidence, but make no mistake, cases are decided on the evidence, not on the truth. Sometimes crimes go unpunished, for example, not because they weren't committed, but because insufficient evidence survived to prove to a jury or to satisfy a jury beyond reasonable doubt that the crime happened and that the accused person committed it. But insufficient evidence that something happened isn't the same as sufficient evidence that nothing happened. And the same is true about historical events. Some historians once questioned, for example, whether Pontius Pilate really existed, or whether he was just a fictional character who was created as part of a story to teach people wisdom or to repackage earlier Greco-Roman philosophy. That changed, of course, with the discovery of the Pilate stone in 1961. And most historians now accept that Pontius Pilate really was the Roman prefect of Judea around 26 to 36 AD. And you saw me earlier put to Hahn a number of propositions, for example, that most historians, and Hahn's no exception, accept as true of Jesus. So, for example, once people questioned the very existence of Jesus, now there's no dispute among anybody here tonight that he actually existed. And they also agree that Jesus lived in Palestine during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, that he had a reputation as a great healer, that he was crucified by order of Pontius Pilate, who was the prefect of Judea, around 30 or 33 AD, they don't know which year, but in April sometime, that he really was dead when the Romans finished crucifying him. They were very good at that sort of thing. That he was buried in a tomb belonging to a local religious leader, Joseph of Arimathea, although there's some controversy about that one. That some women claimed to have found his tomb empty when they visited it after his death, and that some of his followers even claimed to have seen him alive again after he died. That's what the evidence can show, that people claimed to have seen him alive. It's not like it's evidence that he was alive. That requires the additional step. And that's the point here. None of those factual propositions require any belief in God or anything miraculous to be accepted, and Hahn accepts them. You heard that. He may dispute what they mean, but the facts are not controversial in that sense. So the controversy is not what the evidence is, but rather the conclusions that can or should be drawn from it. Now, both Gabby and Hahn have used this concept of onus of proof and have suggested that because it's Christians that are suggesting that something miraculous or supernatural happened, that the onus is somehow on Christians to prove that beyond reasonable doubt. But that's not the way the world works. We're not in court, and there's no judge or jury here that's going to decide for you what you should believe about that based on the evidence. You are the jury, and you must each judge for yourselves what you believe. Whether you think there's sufficient or insufficient evidence, that's a matter for you to determine. There's no magical standard, and every person's different about what evidence is sufficient for them. The starting point, though, is to realise that we each view the world through an ideological prism, whether it's a prism of faith based on our upbringings or belief, or a prism of skepticism based on our education and life experiences. Both types of prisms shape our view of the evidence. In fact, you've probably all heard the saying that justice is blind, and you probably recognise that image up there is an image of Justitia. And the reason that she's blindfolded is because if she wasn't, she may notice the difference between a prince and a pauper, and thereby allow preconceived prejudices or ideas about what probably did or didn't happen in a particular circumstance to influence her judgment. And make no mistake, we all face that same challenge. Jesus himself reportedly acknowledged this when in the story of Lazarus and the rich man he said, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Now, Christians believe Jesus was talking about himself and effectively prophesying what would happen. But whether you believe that or not, it is a challenge for everybody, and this is the challenge that I'll leave you with. Is there any evidence at all that would convince you that the resurrection occurred? Or is your scepticism so complete that even if you could personally talk to Peter, James or Paul about what they saw and heard after Jesus died, you'd still be able to explain it by reference to grief or visionary experiences or mistaken identities? What if you saw the risen Christ with your own eyes? Could you still explain even that as some sort of vision or hallucination or delusion of the mind? Would the only change you make to your lifestyle effectively be to book yourself in for a checkup at your local GP? If so, then your prism may already be so thick and impenetrable that you're effectively blind, not in the way that justice is, but more like the blind faith that atheists have so much fun mocking on atheist blog sites. You see, we all have beliefs, and that's one thing I like about Gabby, is that he acknowledges that he has a belief. He calls it naturalism, you know. He acknowledges atheism's a belief. Lots of people seem to suggest that atheism's the absence of a belief, but it's a belief just like any other. And for many, there's already sufficient evidence for them to believe in something, that's that the resurrection really happened. Others may prefer to believe in nothing. But regardless of what the current evidence is or how you choose to interpret it, the truth will always be the truth, whether you believe it or not.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been treated to something very, very special tonight. And just on a very final point that Andrew referred to, the way in which people talk to one another on the blog sites is, in my view, quite sickening. And we've seen a demonstration tonight of how to conduct ourselves in public with civility and with decency in order that people might reasonably be able to think through the arguments that are being put before them. Voltaire would have been proud of us, and he was no Christian. So thank you very, very much indeed to all four of our speakers, panellists. It's been remarkable, and we thank you for it. To return to something I said at the beginning, this is, in fact, already evidently going to be a century of, it is already a century or an age of great religious ferment. You only have to look at the raw numbers across the major continents of the world. Secularism is something that the West has become deeply adhered to. It's an irony in a way that Christianity was 100 years ago a European religion. Now it's a religion of every other part of the world, but not Europe and the West. Indeed, as Blaise Pascal put it, men hate religion, by which he meant Christianity, for fear it may be true. But that was a Frenchman. He wouldn't find many fellow friends for his position amongst the French today. They're unbelievably secularised. Nonetheless, these issues remain extraordinarily important. It's a wonderfully important thing, I think, to have the opportunity to hear these debates tonight, because I don't believe there's an issue of greater importance. I simply cannot. I mean, we've all agreed, at least out here, that this man walked the surface of the earth. Well, what are we going to do with him? He won't go away. The questions won't go away. And these debates won't go away. I'm reminded of an atheist and his brother, who's a Christian, that I actually enormously respect. Well, did. One has now passed on. Christopher Hitchens, of course, was a very influential atheist thinker and writer. And he, generally speaking, advanced his arguments with passion, but with courtesy. You can find any number of debates where he's taken on Christians and vice versa. And I, as a Christian, find his arguments very challenging indeed, much more so than some of the atheists who choose to mock. But he had a brother called Peter, He's equally academically gifted, very insightful man. And he wrote a book just showing how personal and how close these arguments are being, called The Rage Against God, How Atheism Converted Me to Christianity. I commend it to you. It's an extremely interesting read. But he said something there that I think is extremely important, and I think every one of us needs to be honest about this. Essentially, none of us are completely rational. It doesn't happen. He said quite early on in the book, it's something to the effect of, let's not have any more of this rubbish about us being completely rational. The reality is that all of us involve an element of faith in adopting our worldview. He's right, of course, we do. So therefore, it does become a question, I think, of examining your heart and your head, involving both, I think, in the quest for truth. What can matter more? How do we make sense of this world? One of the most eloquent speeches I ever heard in the House of Representatives in the 19 years that I was there came from Kim Beazley. He's a very fine Australian, I have a lot of time for him. It was on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the ending of the Second World War. And he said something to the effect of, we must never shy away from the unbelievable conundrum of good and evil. We saw in the Second World War the utter depravity that we are capable of, contrasted with the extraordinary nobility that we are capable of. I, for one, have to have answers to that question. So thank you very much indeed, for your time here tonight. The travels you've made, the thought you put into it, the way in which you've conducted the debate. Thank you to the audience for coming out, for your questions. We didn't get through many of them. You might have the chance over a cup of tea. But let me move beyond that and say that City Bible Forum is giving you, all sorts of, or making all sorts of wonderful offers here. I would want you to go away well informed. Firstly, there is a short summation of the key documents that have been referred to tonight. You can also join the mailing list for more events hosted here in Adelaide by City Bible Forum. I think that wraps it up, Craig. Thank you very much for your attendance. We've strayed a little over time, but in the eternal scale of things, a few minutes on matters as important as these hardly matter. Oh, there you go. A necessary evil. International speaker John Stackhouse will ask if we truly want a world without evil. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy your evening. All the best.